ourselves, get back to our true roots and our identity. We all come across subject matter and this topic about self-black hatred, and it's real. And Dr. Wilson says that the Hamitic myth, a large degree of this black hatred. That's heavy. And along the way, those of you guys got the book, if I can remember, I'll try to cite the pages that I'm coming from. So right now, if you have the book, this is between pages 102 and 107. One of the things, as I said at the top in my introduction, Dr. Wilson refers to quite extensively in this point is something called the Hamitic hypothesis. He goes on to say, one of the most pernicious myths relating to the Christian religion is what we call the Hamitic myth. The myth is the myth of the children of Ham, which has been deeply engraved in the African mind and is responsible for a large degree of self-hatred. In looking at this Hamitic mythology, he recommends that we read an article called The Hamitic Hypothesis, Its Origins in Time Perspective. So he goes on to say, at first, the Hamites were defined as black people of African origin. Then over time, in relationship to slavery and economic demands, the Hamitic concept assumed a Caucasian tint. So in other words, we see at one point Hamites and Hamitic, the Hamitic concept was all about being black and dirty. And then we see a shift, and now they had to make it to, now Hamites had a white tint. So he goes on to say, isn't this an interesting view? It's interesting to review the old dictionary to see how the word Hamite is defined. You get this description about dark skin on one hand, and on the other hand, they call Caucasoid Caucasian people. So you got black Caucasians, right? See where we're going with this? So let's look at the Hamitic hypothesis as this scholar Edith Sanders describes it. And I inserted here, and just to kind of give us some context, just so we understand what a hypothesis is. Hypothesis is a supposition or something you're supposing or proposing to be true, or an explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point until you can make further investigation. So it's not fact; it's just assumed and presumed that this is what it is. All right. So the Hamitic hypothesis also is well known to Africa, maybe just a few of us, if any at all. But it basically states that, listen, that everything of value ever found in Africa was brought there by the Hamites. So now you see why the Hamites got to be white. If everything in Africa was ever done by the Hamites, they got to be white. So that's pretty much what the Hamitic hypothesis says. Now, I was going to read large portions of it, but as I read through it and realized a lot of us may not be familiar with it, and some of us maybe just a little bit, I said, I'm not going to read all of that, but I will read just a few key points just to kind of help keep with our context. So I won't read it all verbatim, but I'm just a few key points. And if any of you guys want to dig deeper and dive deeper into this Hamitic hypothesis, I got a copy, or you can go look for it on the internet. But one of the things in this hypothesis, here's right here, 13 pages. And I'll just read it quickly so we can move through our presentation. Edith Sanders says, some 17th century writers acquaint us with the notions current in their time by citing European authors, some known today and some unknown today, who wrote directly or indirectly about how the low position of the Negro Hamites are in the world. This was further strengthened by European travelers who went to Africa for reasons of trade and curiosity. Concurrently, there existed another point of view in which the term Hamite denoted a sinner of some sort. Not necessarily Negro, although the characteristics of the Hamites were the same negative ones voraciously attributed to the Negro. The idea of a Negro Hamite was not universally accepted. Some individuals believed that the blackness of the Negro was caused by the soil in which they lived together with the extreme heat of the sun. Others doubted that either the climate theory or the efficacy of Noah's curse was responsible for the Negro's physiognomy. Yeah, I can't pronounce that word. But reasoned that their color and wool are innate and seminal was there from the very beginning. By and large, however, the Negro was seen as a descendant of Ham, bearing the stigma of Noah's curse. This view was compatible with the various interests at the time. On the one hand, it allowed the exploitation of the Negro for economic gain to remain undisturbed by any Christian doubts as to the moral issue involved. Then, he went on to say, at the end of the 18th century, many famous men espoused and popularized one of two views regarding the Negro. One was that he was the result of degeneration due to the various environmental conditions. The other was more frequent view was that he was a separate creation, a subhuman creation, subhuman in character. In other words, he was cursed. The Western world, which was growing increasingly rich in the institution of slavery, grew increasingly reluctant to look at the Negro slave and to see him as a brother under the skin. Some writers feel that the image of the Negro deteriorated in direct proportion to his value as a commodity, and the proudly rational and scientific white man was impatient to find some definitive proof for the exclusion of the Negro from the family of man and for ultimate denial of common ancestry. The catalyst which made this possible was an historical event, namely Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Because Napoleon shared the passion for science and antiquities that was a hallmark of the Enlightenment period. He invited archaeologists and other scientists to join him. The experts who had accompanied him discovered treasures that led them to found the new science of Egyptology and the institutes on Egyptian soil. Then last thing I read that. Napoleon's scientists made the revolutionary discovery that the beginnings of Western civilization were earlier than the civilizations of the Romans and the Greeks. Mysterious monuments, evidence of the beginnings of science and arts, as well-preserved mummies were uncovered. Attentions were drawn to the population that lived among these ancient splendors and was presumably descended from the people who had created them. It was a well-mixed population, such as it is at the present time, with physical types running from the light to the black, with many physiognomical, variations. The French scholars who came to the conclusion that the Egyptians were Negroids. In other words, these French scholars came to the conclusion that the Egyptians were black. They were Negro. They were black. Then he names these scholars in the period of Napoleon. He said on their original exposition, they described these black Egyptians. That's important because nowadays Egyptians don't consider themselves black. They don't even consider themselves part of Africa. And guess where Egypt is? It's in Africa. But the Napoleon scientists and those on his expedition characterized these Egyptians as having a broad and flat nose. Some of them were short, had a flat mouth, and thick lips. Sound like us. The view that the Egyptians were Negroid and highly civilized apparently existed well before the French expedition in Egypt. A gentleman named Comte Barney, a French traveler to the Middle East, spent 4 years in Egypt and Syria and wrote this well-known book. Finally, a few short years after this expedition, there appeared a large number of publications dealing with Egypt and Egyptians. Many of these works seem to have had their main purpose in an attempt to prove in some way that the Egyptians were not Negroes. Okay, and on and on and on. So this whole Hamitic business, according to Dr. Amos Wilson, is the source and the basis of our self-hatred. Dr. Wilson springboards off of this Hamitic hypothesis, saying that simply means you don't necessarily just hate your skin color, but he says this whole idea of taking away anything of value that's from African people. And this was one of the major purposes for, he said, that while here, especially here in the West, that there's been a rewriting, a revisionism, or a censorship of our history to take away anything of value from African people. And you might say, well, I don't hate myself. Well, just think about it without digressing too much. I mean, all of us have been guilty of being guilty now. Maybe we don't say, I hate African folk, but we have said things like, But if you want something done right, you got to go to the white man. Well, Negroes show. Well, you can't trust a Negro. So that's where we're going at. So Amos is saying that the root is deep seated in this whole idea about the curse of Ham, right? And so he says that they had to justify censoring out history and all these other things like that's named in this Hamitic hypothesis. So with respect to censorship in the United States, am I still right there? Yeah. Censorship in the United States is extensive and deep. We're often led to believe that censorship is practiced only in countries like Russia, and it's only limited to airplay on the TV, what you can't see on the big screen, censoring out, radio airplay. But it's also done in the marketplace and in our educational system. Yeah. He says in the case of textbooks, excuse me, the editor gauges the educational policies and makes determinations whether such a book matches the religious, social, and political values in those states and or their communities. Then, based on the observation of these values, they'll strike out any passages they don't think is worth putting in there. That's why there's a whole lot of things that we will never realize about our history and our culture in our American system because of this type of censorship. That's all I'll say right there. And he did go on to say that this type of censorship, that's why forums like this and ministries like ours are so important and such a blessing. Because we won't realize a lot of this stuff. Amos says censorship takes place painlessly and very subtly. And consequently, it often operates without you even being aware of it. We go through all of our schools. We go through all of our college. We come out smart with our bachelor's and master's degrees and don't know nothing about ourselves. Wow, that's all by design. All to perpetuate this idea that anything that's ever found in Africa, anything about blackness, has no value, particularly being because it's the curse, if you will, from Ham's curse. Then he goes on to say that manifests in our approach to commercialism. He asked the question, he said, what would happen, what do you think would happen? Maybe some of us ask ourselves this. He said, what do you think would happen to our CDs, our radio stations, our main commerce, our banking system, our computers, and all this stuff if we were to disengage ourselves from this white system, from the white man, right? He said this comes out of our unconscious or conscious belief that if white people wasn't in the world, we would have all the stuff that we have. Now, I don't assert my opinion, well, not my opinion, but my concurrence with that. Think about it, maybe we don't say it this way. Maybe we don't say consciously that, boy, the world wouldn't be as great as it is if it wasn't for the white man. Maybe we don't say that. But let's flip it. What do we say about ourselves, or what do we know about ourselves that we can say that has attributed to the good that's in the world? And the way it's presented, nothing, All right. Then he goes on to say of this Hamitic hypothesis author, she asserts that the Hamitic Caucasoid, the northeastern Africans, were responsible for introducing the non-Semitic Asiatic African language. So in other words, I won't read all that. In other words, Amos is just going back to this hypothesis that I read from and just saying that she's arguing how, that here again, they're justifying that black Africans didn't bring any value to even the African civilization. Anything of value, whether it be language or being civil and technology, was a result from the North Caucasoid Hamites, not the cursed ones from Ham. All right? And as Dr. Wilson is still telling us that this is the rotten root of self-hatred, he points us to verse 24 in Genesis chapter 9. For those of you guys that are familiar with the passage, that passage is where Ham and Shem and Japheth, they saw their daddy Noah, apparently walked in and found daddy butt naked. And then the story says that Ham went out and told his brother Shem and Japheth, and they came in walking in backwards because they didn't want to see daddy naked. And then when Noah realized what happened, he got mad, and then he cursed Ham and his grandkids because of what happened, right? So that's what the story is. And so Amos comments on this and says, so, and I quote, this is directly from the book, this son Ham sees his father naked, and he goes out and tells his other brothers, Daddy ain't that naked, y'all. Then they come in and cover him up, and Noah wakes up and says, well now, since you saw me butt naked, I'm going to curse you and your sons. And Amos says, isn't that wild? Isn't that absurd? And so he says this to reinforce his point. He said, we can see pretty clear how the Europeans have repeatedly associated negative attributes to black skin and Africans, so that every time we think of bad things, we often think of Africans. And every time we think of Africans, we think of bad things. One of the things associated, the bad things associated with Africans and blacks is servitude. That was, you catch that? Since Ham was cursed, and the part of that curse was that you're going to be the servant of servants, you're going to serve Japhet, and you're going to serve the house of Shem and Japhet, since you're black. That means he's saying that we have grabbed a hold of that attitude and we associate everything with black as servitude. So he goes on to say that, so almost any person reading the word slave, particularly in the Old Text, would automatically read into it black, even though there is no description of ethnicity whatsoever. And he reminds us that white folks were served as slaves too. Literally from the beginning of the time, the European system was based on slavery and the enslavement of their own people. But he said, but somehow through this revisionist history and this censorship and reconstructing of perspective, servitude and slavery has been attached to black folk only. Wow. And then, Sanders goes on to observe in part of this hypothesis, which I didn't read all of it to you. She says, and I think this was worth noting, any idea of race with reference to the sons of Noah, including Ham, concerning his descendants, didn't appear to much later anyway. Hence her argument about this being just a myth. She goes on to point out that it was only until the 6th century, or 600 AD, 600 years after Christ died, in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a collection of oral traditions of the Jews. It's just traditions that they pass down orally, that they hold, as sacred. An anthropology of their old Torah, a record of their rabbinic debates, and so forth and so on. And she goes on to say, now, concerning history and church history, there's, Amos points out rather, that many of us, especially us good old Christians, that's part of our downfall. We are not in tune with church history. All we need is Jesus and Sunday morning. And we're not in tune with church history, so we hear stuff, we YouTube University, people tell us stuff, and we grab a hold to it, and there we go, we run right into it. So he goes on to say that we can't forget this. He says those in church and those who are a little insecure about our religious beliefs, sometimes we just don't want to look at church history for what it is. He said we don't want to face the fact that many so-called books in the Bible that purport to tell of religious happenings were written well after Jesus, so they deserve scrutiny. Be like the Bereans, check the scripture, right? Okay. So the next sub-point, under point number 1, so I can make most of my time transitioning, he says that to help us to come to terms with that the idea of the Hamitic curse of blackness, it don't come from the Bible anyway, right? And if you got your book, we are now on page 109. The idea of the Hamitic curse doesn't come from the Bible. Now, I know what you're saying. You're probably thinking, well, it's there in Genesis chapter 29. Well, the account of the story is there, but the idea of Ham as a race being cursed is not biblical. He points us back to say that it comes from a collection of mythology of another people and a collection of oral traditions from other people. In other words, what has been placed upon us and what a lot of us grab a hold to didn't come from us, and it didn't come from God, it didn't come from other people. It didn't come from their oral traditions. Therefore, it becomes very important for us to recognize the origins and concepts of this curse of Ham on black people. He goes on to say, let me change the slide, sorry about that. I was in the right place. Yeah. So, he says, so in earlier traditions of others identified the Hamites with Negroes and endowed them both with certain physiognomic attributes. Now, I had to look that up. Y'all know some introduction. I have a hard time pronouncing that. But that's just a fancy scientific word that says facial features that's held to show qualities of mind or character. So in other words, these folk said that if you looked a certain way, that means you had these certain negative qualities. So you got bad quality because your skin black. That's Andre's interpretation. And you had an undesirable character because of the way you look. Wow. He goes on to say this notion, this physiognomic notion, persisted through the Middle Ages, when the rabbis, when the rabbinical expansionists of the Genesis story were still being written. Ham and some of them even said that they had supposedly emasculated Noah. So after Noah cursed him and all that, some of these rabbinical writers said that evidently they got upset one day and cut Noah's balls off. Cut Noah's genitals off. This side note. Anyway, so this whole game of attaching negative characteristics to Africanicity has been going on a very long time, Amos says. He goes on to tell us that lies were still being created all the way through the 1500s and the 1600s. And again, they were passed down until ultimately absorbed into the psyche of black people, right? And then so Sanders, she quotes from one of these oral traditions in the Talmud to point out how they continued this tradition to justify the enslavement of the Canaanites by the Israelites. Here's the quote from the Talmud. Now I cannot beget the fourth son, whose children I would have ordered to serve you and your brothers. So Noah intended to have another, therefore I must be Canaan, your firstborn, whom they enslaved. And since you have disabled me, this is where they get this idea that Noah was castrated. Since you have disabled me, doing ugly things in the blackness of night, Canaan's children shall be born ugly and black. Moreover, because you twisted your head around and see my nakedness, your grandchildren's hair shall be twisted into kinks, and their eyes red, again because your lips jested at my misfortune. So there shall swell, in other words, so your lips going to be big. And because you neglected my nakedness, now the scripture said, our scripture says that they went and covered him up. But this old tradition said they neglected my nakedness. So it says because that's what happened, then y'all going to go naked. And the male members shall be shamefully elongated. Men of this race, therefore, are called Negroes. Their forefather Canaan commanded them to love theft and fornication, to band together in hatred of their masters and never to tell the truth. Now, just a side note, think about it now. That's an oral tradition of the Jewish elite, the rabbis. Think about some of this oral tradition being passed on in our universities from the intellectual elite. And we're going, yeah, you sure right. Maybe we are cursed. Anyway, so the next sub-point is that we got to get, and then we'll move on. Scripture, he wants us to understand that Scripture was used to justify and support and reinforce 19th century slavery. I think most of us have come to terms with that. It's not that Scripture ordained it, but Scripture was used to justify and reinforce 19th century slavery. And there's another book, I'm not plugging books, I'm just giving some information, by an author named Anthea Butler. She has a book called White Evangelical Racism. She points out basically the same thing. She says in her book, talking about slavery and alluding to the Hamitic myth, she says two of the most cited scriptures in the 19th century that were used was the one we just read at the top, Genesis 9, verses 18 to 27, and also Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 to 7. We know most of those. That Genesis talking about cursing Ham, then Ephesians talking about slave, be subject to your masters. And so, and then goes on to say to us, though, one was an admonition. The other was a justification for why people of African descent were to be enslaved. She explains that the Genesis scripture passage tells the story of Noah's three boys. I've already told you the story. But she goes on to say that after Ham, when told his brothers, They came in apparently walking backwards with their eyes closed so they wouldn't see. And Noah got mad and cursed them. And so she recounts that story, and she basically is in agreement with Dr. Wilson, said, isn't that absurd? Rather than looking at it objectively and looking at it in context, we look at it and grab a hold to what the oral tradition suggests to us. And Thea goes on to explain, though, that 19th century expositors generally regarded Canaan as Africa and interpreted Ham as representing black people. They concluded that Noah's curse relegated black people to chattel slavery. These are 19th century Bible expositors come to that conclusion. The name Ham was interpreted erroneously to mean dark or black. See there? Did you catch that? She points out that the name Ham, which most of us associate with being black and dark, she said it was erroneously interpreted to mean that. And this particular scripture became the foundation of biblical justification for many southern slaveholders in the United States. And then as far as Ephesians chapter 6, that verse, it says, offer slaveholders a more compelling argument, where it talks about, slaves to be subject to your master and so forth. So what they did is just took that out of context and see what they say. And you're a slave, you're going to be a slave and be subject to your masters. So that's my condensing what she's saying in that point. Let's see if there's anything else there. And she also, many of us may not know this, and she also points out that along with perpetuating the Hamitic myth and justifying and rationalizing slavery, she points out that there was even a slave Bible produced. Now, a few of us in Rose Terrace are aware of that. I don't know how many of you guys out there are aware of that. There was a slave Bible produced in England. We talked about censorship at the top that omitted passages about freedom. In some places, whole books of the Bible were omitted and then passed off as the Bible, the slave Bible. Talking about censorship. Okay. So we see here a rewriting, a revision of history and enslavement, recasting the Canaanites as being cursed by God. Now, if you're in your book, I'm now moving forward on page 113. And this point here is where we'll talk a little bit about religion, how religion has been one of the greatest motivators of not only slavery, but of war. So Amos says religion has been one of the greatest motivating factors of war that you'll ever find in history. That is to say, religion falsely projected. He goes on to tell us that too many people are not truly aware of European history. If you study European history, it will reveal, for example, the major cause of great epidemics, let alone wars of conquest. He mentions like the bubonic plague, which afflicted Europeans. It was partially a result of the filthiness of these cities. And he said a lot of that history, as it relates to European malactions, are not even dealt with anymore. He said the destructions of the Europeans throughout their own filthy behavior led to a need for capturing slaves. So as they moved through their own civilization and their own process of living and destroying and making stuff filthy, it necessitated a need to capture slaves. Then this in turn led to the need to further rationalize capturing slaves. Hence, again, the revision, the rewriting of history and creating myths. So Amos says, so of course we can see these myths being created in terms of black people. By and large, however, the Negro, seen as a descendant of Ham, bearing the stigma of Noah's curse. He said this view was compatible with the various interests existing at the time. Amos goes on to say that cursing serves a very important function in the destruction of another individual. He says, have you ever seen another person and say, I love you, I worship you, you're my God, and then strike that same person down? He says that the white men, or the wise men, the white men are supposed to be wise, of the religious Christian realm of the day, they came forth and created myths and justifications for the enslavement and destruction of the people. On the other hand, he goes on to say there was also a lot of exploitation. In other words, they had a need, a reason to exploit black folk for economic gain. And so They also went ahead and created a myth and said, well, we're not doing anything bad because after all, they cursed of Ham. So he went on to say, but they need to maintain, they need to remain undisturbed by any doubts of any moral issues that they have. In other words, they wanted to feel good that they were doing bad. And if you can justify people as roaches and bugs and the scum of the earth, you don't have to feel bad about throwing them away, exterminating them, and killing them. Just like you kill roaches in your house, you exterminate rats and pests. So it is with the mindset of these white folks. Once you convince yourself that the black man is a natural servant and that he was put in his position by God, then you can rest well at night and sleep. I just should have read that. That's what Amos is suggesting. And then, as I transition, he says, but they had a problem with that. They had a major problem because you see, when they made the Hamites black, a major problem occurred, as I read to you in the Hamitic hypothesis. Napoleon exposed their whole myth. In 1798, Napoleon went to Egypt and said, hey, wait a minute. These folk ain't what you said. These folk are responsible for all this stuff you saying that the Caucasoid Negro was responsible for. So Napoleon's scientists made a revolutionary discovery that the beginnings of the Western civilization were earlier than the civilization of the Romans and the Greeks. So that conclusion, of course, flies in the face of most Eurocentric justification for the enslavement of black people. And it runs directly into that theological nonsense about the black man being cursed. All right. Now, see, that was the first point. And that was only part of that whole Hamitic hypothesis. But let's move forward. So in transition, as far as the Hamites, originally defined as black and cursed, they had to be redefined as white. White scholars were saying woolly hair, black skin, big nose, thick lips doesn't mean the man is Negroid. So, of course, in order to justify slavery, the beautiful and wonderful legacy of the African would have to be stolen. There's a book by George James called The Stolen Legacy. Some of you guys never heard Pastor talk about this. And it points out that. And it points to a generational trend that the black man must be robbed of anything worth accomplishment. He must be made to appear that he ain't done nothing. Wow. Now, the power of definition. And if you're in your book, we're on page 120 now. The power of definition. It says, we must, as a people, remove the power of definition from the white man, from this white supremacist system. But we can only do that by gaining power ourselves, because often the power to define is related to economic, social, and political power. In order to stop these people, this system from defining reality and reality for us, even defining us, we got to take away their power of definition and take away their economic and social power. That sound familiar? It's also said, and Pastor said this time and time again, that here's the golden rule, not like most of us know it. The golden rule, he who has the gold rules. That is the case. He who has the power rules. How much power do we collectively as black people have? He who has the power rules. Economic, social, political will write the rules and will definitely define reality. So long as we have no power, we don't, coalesce and galvanize and have power, we won't have power and we won't be able to rule, what he's saying. And as it relates to definition, because they had the power for so long, they have defined us as being savages. And Amos Wilson talks about savagery versus civility. He says that this idea of the black man, the idea that the black man is uncivilized and is a savage. And so I like kind of how he flipped it. He goes on to say, but the savage has been given a very bad name. It's been given very bad press. Because usually when you think of savage, you think, wow, ooh, that's horrible. But he said, listen, there's no one who behaves more savagely than the modern man. And you can just get in your mind who the modern man is. The white man, or it could be a white supremacist black man. Right? So there's no one who behaves more savagely than the modern man. It would be a relief if we related to each other as savages. And I said, okay, where are you going with it, Dr. Smith? He said, throw aside the prejudices and really read the social organization and social relationships among so-called primitive people. You then recognize that man, he has become much more civilized and has become more savage. You will recognize that man, as he has become more civilized, has become more savage. Did you catch that? In other words, this society will have us to think, vice presidents will have us to think, the more civilized you act, the more education you get, you're doing something. But he's going on to say, the more you become more civilized or whitenized, Europeanized, the more savage you become. Listen, all of us have been to college, been to school. I'm just going to go right down the middle. Either the Eurocentric, talking about power definition, savage versus civility, moving into education. The Eurocentrically educated man is the most dangerous animal the world has ever seen. Remember, being civilized, but now you become more savage in your civility. When the earth is destroyed, listen, it won't be destroyed. It will be destroyed by people with PhD degrees, not by murderers, thugs, crack dealers, and rapists, and gay folk. Wow. All the folk that people tend to, talk bad about and, all that. Dr. Wilson suggested that the world, when it is destroyed, it ain't going to be destroyed by those folks. It's going to be destroyed by these Eurocentric educated people. That's heavy. But by the model citizen who went to the right schools and to the right colleges, those will be the destroyers of the world. He says, but these are model citizens, though, who are the result of going to these right schools and right colleges, create weaponry and the means of destroying themselves and ultimately life on this planet. Wow. That's what Dr. Wilson said. Now, they're already getting to immigrate with their racial ideology and their thieving nature to the other planets of the universe. Now, I thought that was interesting. Did you hear what? Let me read it one more time. Think about trips to space we just had this year. Dr. Wilson said back then, now these folk are already getting ready to immigrate, to move, to migrate with their racist ideologies and their thieving nature to the other planets of the universe. Now this one, I'm just going to read it like it is. And I'm not even going to apologize for it. And I thought about it. Those of us that think we got a little bit of education, we better check ourselves. Dr. Wilson, in talking about this education, he goes on to say, the educated man, or woman, educated to a good extent in the European universities, is nothing but an educated whore. He is educated without religious or ethical values, without the appropriate psychology and ideology, and without any reverence for life. Listen, I know it's going to sting because most of us have been down this road. God forbid we're still there. This person, he's only educated to love money, honor, and accolades. I might add, want to live here, want to drive here, want to get this, want to dress like that, want to be the first Negro to do that. He's educated into a narrow professionalism so that he cannot see the connection between what he is doing and what else is going on in the world. And I might say parenthetically, but just getting his bag. So he's saying, those folk, my friend, are nothing but educated whores. Think about it this way. And I'm not demeaning the personhood of anybody, but a whore, by definition, by trade, she trades a service, a task, or whatever, pleasure, simply for the dollar. Without even thinking of, what else is going on in the world. It's about that moment. At that marinade. Now, he goes on to say, up under that, speaking of education, it's not even about an equal education, but a different education. I had to marinate on this, because, in the system of it, it's all about an equal education. We need to fight for equal education. But Dr. Amos Wilson said, no, not necessarily, but about a different education as black folk. He said the issue is not getting the same education they got. We must get a different education if we are to save ourselves, mankind, and to remove this Eurocentric menace that plagues all of us. Because when you look at it very closely, you'll recognize that an Afrocentric education, it is fundamentally different. I get the sad part about that, and many of us haven't looked at it, we wouldn't know. Thank God for poems like this. I'm on page 122 now if you got your book. He goes on to say, you will not hand, he's saying that if you think about it, when you think about it, you're not just going to hand over to the greedy, the lustful, unspiritual, unethical people anything that's going to help build them up so they can surpass you. As Pastor would say, you think these white folk, this white system, going to allow you, even let you pay to get an education so that you can supersede them? I don't think so. That's what the book says. So it says, not simply, and you're not going to be able to do that. He says, knowledge must be guarded carefully, and it should be guarded by people who have a sense of ethics and reverence for life. If you notice that, that's just the converse of what he said the educated whore was. The educated whore doesn't have a sense of ethics and reverence for life. But he said that if we're going to get this thing right, we need to be guarded and have a sense of ethics and reverence for life as we get educated. Not simply because you're going to get a good IQ test, going to pass the SAT. And my wife will tell you, we've been more intense about this around our house. Not because we're trying to be something, but we see it now. My boy got to take the, what you call the test? Whatever test that they take. He got to take that test where he got to pass it. But even in him having to pass this STAR test, yeah. Even as he got to pass the STAR test and Andrea has to take her test or exams, her final exam this semester, she needs her pride to do that. But if she doesn't have, if my boys don't have a sense of ethics and a reverence for life or a purpose and or what they ought to do with the education, then they're just young educated hoes. That's heavy. So you don't have to hand knowledge out to just anybody, Amos is saying, in any circumstance. It's just too dangerous. Otherwise, we'll continue to be victimized by this whole system. All right? Then, let me go to the function of education. Enough about that. Page 124. The function of education. I like what Louis Farrakhan said. He said, in education, not indoctrination, not regurgitation of information, but in education is supposed to be the proper cultivation of the gifts and talents of an individual as he gets knowledge. That knowledge satisfies our natural thirst for gaining that which makes us one with our Creator. So true education is what cultivates the person, the mind, the body, and spirit, and brings us closer to fulfilling our purpose for being, which is to reflect our Creator. The second purpose for education, after self-cultivation, is to teach us how to give proper service to self, family, community, nation, and then the world. Wow. See how that has a sense of ethics and responsibility and not just being a whore for education? So the function of education, Dr. Amos Wilson said, that's one of our major problems. It's one of the major problems with us is that we look upon education exclusively as a means to get a job, to get a big bag, to get status. Just be real about it. Many of us have been guilty. But he said this is a ruinous, backwards way of looking at education. The major function of education is to protect the interests of our people, to advance the people, to advance their interests, but more than that, back at the top of the second point, to control, to regain, and to maintain power. That is the function of education. You produce educated people so that these objectives can be achieved, not just so you can achieve a big bag. The educated person is a product of the need to protect one's own interests. In other words, he said, you don't get educated first. You decide what kind of people are needed to protect your survival first. Let me read that again. You don't just, I'm going to get me a good degree so I can get me a good job. I can say that like that because that's how I thought. Nothing wrong with a good job, but that's still narrow. He's saying that you don't get educated first. You decide what kind of people are needed to protect your survival first. Then you educate them in those terms. You must measure the value of your education in terms of the degree in which it will ensure your survival. I got a couple of things on my wall. Teresa got some, Pastor got some. But I wonder how much those pieces of paper in those plaques are really going to help protect our survival of our people. Might give us a big bag, might not. What about the survival of our people? The ideology of going to school only for jobs and only for status will only get you temporary relief, not a cure from your main problem, Dr. Amos Wilson says. And he goes on to say, you are kidding yourself if if you think white folk, this white system, that prestigious university, that wonderful job is going to educate you, allow you to be elevated so you can be equal with them. And I quote, he said, you got to be out of your mind. Now I can say that like that too because I thought that. Pastor told me years ago, he said, man, you're a good guy, but you're too idealistic. Get your education, go to work, and you be responsible. Man, I ain't be that one person, but the whole system and construct. These folk ain't gonna let you outdo them. They ain't gonna let you supersede their boys and girls, and you gotta be out your mind. All right. I know that's what it is, though. They smile and pat us on the back. Oh, that's wonderful. You got your degree. Let's talk about giving you that 5-cent raise, even though you never get a promotion. You never own this company.
Yeah.
Anyway. Then he goes on to say, point number 4, consumeristic inducement of self-hatred. Those you got your book, we're on page 125 to 130 now. He says, consumeristic inducement of self-hatred. He tells us that in this inducement of consumeristic, this consumeristic inducement of self-hatred involves manipulating our critical thinking and our critical capacities. In other words, emotionalism, sensationalism, and image projection. And I was sharing this with Teresa a couple of weeks ago. So they manipulate our minds by playing to how we feel, what we think, what I like. You don't even know what you like. And they get all that with an image. They appeal to the feelings and senses and then project the image. They make good music. What you think commercials is all about? What you think Super Bowl halftime is all about? What you think the big signs of this in South Dallas is all about? Make good music. Make things that sound good. Make things that make you feel good. And then they project the image and marry the two together, and there we go. We watching the movie. I think I want some popcorn. But I just ate dinner before I went to the movie. Now it's popcorn. You keep throwing image and sounds together, and after a while, they'll want whatever the image is. And he gives this long thing about Coke, and I'm old enough to know when Coke was the real thing. It's the real thing. I ain't know the commercials. See how they get you? And then all these other products that came up under Coke, Pepsi and Cherry Coke. But you gotta remember, Coke, classic Coke is the real thing. So I wasn't nobody, or you wasn't nobody if you didn't get the real thing. So he moves on to say how they use that as propaganda. Propagandizing, the spreading of information and ideas or rumors, listen, for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution or cause of a person. In other words, propagandizing is not just advertising a service. He's saying that in our context, propagandization is used solely for the purpose of injuring our institutions and messing us up, if I put it in my own terms. In terms of white and black relationships, one of the things that has not changed very significantly, at least up until this point, listen, is the white man's control of information. Pastor allowed me to do a presentation on the hip-hop culture, and that was one of the things I talked about. And that's not taken away from many of our conscious brothers and sisters who are on target with their liberty to create as they will and their consciousness about who they are and their messaging to the people. But there's a whole other segment of people, even in our people group, who haven't seen this yet. We don't realize that ownership is important. And even today, and I pulled a report, and I had this in my presentation, but for the sake of time, I pulled it out. If we look at the music, the media, and everybody, well, what about Jay-Z? What about Beyonce, and Oprah, and all those? They just a portion, though. But when you look at this thing on a larger scale, we really don't own anything to promote or even propagandize our thoughts, our consciousness. And if we're not doing it, guess who's doing it? Even in our education system, it's the whites, the white supremacy system. The white controllers, the non-black controllers of communication and information are still the profiteers. So the image of African American financial success, listen to me, and wealth propagandized to us is only but an image compared to the real profiteers. And that's why I mentioned Oprah and Beyonce and them. I ain't hating on them. I want them to get their money. But because that's what we see, it's not by accident, and it's not just because they rich are doing well, but it's also by design that the folk who own this stuff want us to see. That's what it's like to be successful. But that's minuscule compared to the real profiteers. You go look at Jimmy Iovine, Clive Davis, them guys that you don't really see too much. Some of y'all guys might know those names. Those guys are behind Interscope Records and Jive Records. Yeah, Beyonce and them, and they paid. But compared to them guys, the profiteers, man, they ain't got no money. And then so Dr. Wilson goes on to make the same point about talking about people like Bill Cosby, Brian Gumble, so forth and so on. But it's just a fraction. He goes on to say, blacks are only getting a fraction of what we are producing. I don't care what it is. We're producing music, clothing, whatever. He says we're only getting a fraction of what we're producing. And what I did include, you can look it up if you want to. Statista.com gives us an idea as it relates to music. As of 2018, listen, of all the 13 major music genres in Black America, including R&B and hip hop, they are the largest. Hip hop at 69% and R&B at 53%. Now, do you think that the few people that we're familiar with who get big bags out there, just pick one, your favorite artist that we see on they rich. Do you really think they're really getting what the unseen white profiteers are getting? No. So our major cultural product is not under our control, is all I'm saying to y'all, Dr. Amos is saying. And yet other people still live off of it. Yeah. So propaganda is deliberately thought out, and it's very clear. Black people like basketball, Dr. Amos said. They like to watch people dunk. I teach my boy all the time, I said, boy, you better, don't just think about dunking, you better think about getting some in their head. So let's see how a black man dunking basketball and drinking Coca-Cola. If they like this man dunking basketball, and we show them a Coca-Cola commercial while he dunking basketball, they're going to buy our product, Coca-Cola. I thought that was a nice illustration. Then creating of negative characteristics in target groups. And I'll just hit this real quick. This is also a part of this consumeristic inducement of self-hatred. You got to create negative characteristics in a target group or individuals. And Dr. Amos Wilson on page 130 says it's about attitudes. Attitudes, in their deepest sense, are sources of actions, rationales for acting. Attitudes influence individuals to perceive the world in a particular way. One of the mantras that I've heard in my circles, even in church, your attitude determines your altitude, right? So when a person holds a particular attitude toward another, he often actualizes that attitude. In other words, you keep seeing somebody a certain way, you got a funky attitude toward somebody a certain way, at some point you're going to be funky toward that person a certain way. That's all he's saying. Through his behavior, if he is a person of influence, a person of power, and a person of authority, he will often actually create the object of their attitude with certain characteristics that were not there beforehand. Decent African American people like us, people in power create an attitude in their face, in their head about us. They see us as dirty, filthy Hamites, and consequently they treat us like dirty, filthy Hamites, as it were. Because the opinion held by the person in power is projected through his behavior in the relationship to the inferior person, and therefore, as that person so is to react. In other words, that person to which that bad attitude is projected toward, he becomes a creation of the more powerful person, hence a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, this system sees us as criminals, robbers, thieves, thugs, and whores, and that's how they treat us. Make sense? Number 5. Self-fulfilling prophecy displayed in classrooms. Keep in mind, we're still talking about this attitude, this projection of attitudes, self-fulfilling prophecy of that attitude toward us from people in power. Dr. Amos Wilson says the black child goes into the classroom And by now, their blackness is already associated with dumbness. Me and my wife had a conversation about this last week or so. It's not, but I jumped too far ahead. Just wanted to say about some of mine. Without dismissing, there are times when people need medical attention, get that. They need psychological evaluation, get all of that. But if the jumping off point is because they are young and maybe got some training issues they need to be addressed and they have to be black, don't just be talking about they dumb and they need some dope and need some, psych medication. You dig what I'm saying? That was just, but anyway. But he goes on to say that many of our black children, they go into the classroom and are already associated with dumbness and being bad and being irate, being hostile because they're black. But probably much more sinister, they're already seen with this attitude of the inability to learn. They already got behavioral problems because they're black. They just the cursed Hamites, and they like to marry one another, they like to steal and have sex, and they got big genitals, big lips. You know black folk. They go into the classroom already perceived as such with all other kind of negative images. Therefore, this is the expected behavior of him. Because this is the expected behavior of him, he is related to in these terms of that expectation. So you, the teacher, you may not decide to teach him anything. Now, I'm not a teacher in the classroom context, and I guess Teresa can tell you or not, and let's just be real about it. Depending on where you are, you can be guilty too. So he's simply saying, if your attitude is messed up like that, then no wonder your first reaction will be, oh, I can't do nothing with him. He can't learn nothing. But is it really that he can't learn nothing, or there's something else going on? All right? So he goes on to say, when you have identified certain people as ugly or pretty, your judgment of them will reflect that opinion. And consequently, your treatment and punishment of them will reflect that same opinion as well. So if you look at the behavior of teachers, many of us got or have had children in school, high school, middle school, elementary school, and we can attest to this. I know I can. I've had to make several trips down to my boys' middle school and high school. But if you look at the behavior of teachers who are often unconscious of their own behaviors as they move between various groups, they tend to flow or ebb and flow or vacillate with their expectation levels. He goes on to say, it's been demonstrated in many studies that teachers' expectations of students have very definite and measurable effects on the scores of students that they make on their achievement tests. In other words, there is a direct correlation of how students perform with how teachers treat them. Right? Mm-hmm. Children can sense being treated differently. Now, I'll be careful when I say this, and when it's time for us to talk, and y'all can talk about it. But children can sense being treated differently. I'm not saying that there's any justification for overtly and consciously acting out. But at the same time, you can't help, in many cases, a child acting out when he knows that you're treating him sideways. I go in and do my work best I can. Maybe I didn't finish my homework. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe I got problems at home. But because you see me as black, bad, dumb, unable to learn, you treat me some kind of way. Well, shoot, I'm feeling some kind of way now. So children, and I might just add, for those of us in our church, we need to be conscious that even at home, in our household, our kids can know when we're coming sideways with them. We want to teach them and tell them the truth, but they know when we're coming sideways, and then we get mad with them because they react. Anyway, it's been shown very clearly that in mainly integrated schools, the severest punishment and suspensions for misbehavior are given to black students, although white students commit the same behavior. We see that all throughout society. You let me be rolling down the street on the weekend, and let's say this is what I do. Got passed. I roll down, and I got a roach, or I got me a joint in my cigarette tray. And they don't give me the business. But you let white Tommy get caught with 2 ounces of cocaine, he get probation. It's the same. Then anger. We're rushing on to a close. And I won't stay here very long. He says anger is a very dangerous emotion that is to be handled very carefully. When not dealt with carefully, the person will lose capacity for reason. He loses his good sense, often making decisions that in a cooler moment he would otherwise have not made. In other words, Amos is saying to us that anger, unguided anger, uncontrolled anger, untempered anger, being untempered, it distorts reality, your vision of reality. Often our people are provoked into anger because, see, there is a righteous indignation. Somebody break in my house and start trying to kill me and all this kind of stuff. It's not time to go to pray and ask God to give me temperament and to be nice. I need to kick into some righteous anger and take care of business. That's different. But he's saying to us that oftentimes our people are provoked into anger, teased into anger, made angry or whatever, so on purpose, so that we can engage in self-defeating reactions. In other words, many times, us brothers, we go out on the streets, a lot of times these white cops, not all of them, but a lot of them, this whole idea of them pulling us over, they are not only just profiling us, they're expecting us to, buck up, and now they can shoot us. You dig what I'm saying? They're expecting our young people to act crazy in the classroom so they can send them on in that pipeline to prison. So he's saying that we got to come to terms with how we deal with this anger. And a lot of times we are provoked into anger because the expectation is self-defeating reactions. So the individual gets angry and he outbursts, and consequently he's punished. As a result of being punished, he begins to view himself negatively. Keep on getting punished. Well, let me just say this, I can condense this point. You keep on kicking the dog is going to find the last shot and bite you, and you keep on kicking, biting the dog finally going to just become a mean dog. Keep on reacting in anger, you're going to become an angry person. An angry person keep reacting in anger, doing angry stuff, and you end up dead or in jail. Right? Okay. Dr. Wilson goes on to say, it is through anger and resentment, in parentheses, that we end up developing or reacting to that bad and evil qualities of the superior person are injected into that inferior person. Did you catch that? The inferior person is transformed through and by his own anger. Now he becomes a criminal. Now he becomes intemperate. Think about some things we say. It ain't cool to say, man, I take nothing off nobody. That ain't cool. You're intemperate, intolerant. Anger works out in very specific ways, the point that it can lead to is suicide and self-destructive behavior. Next sub-point, so we can move on. Individuality. All I'll say about that, Amos Wilson said that individuality, Amos refers to individuality as mythology and as pure nonsense that people, particularly us black folk, are great believers in. We believe about doing me. I'm just trying to do me, which is geared toward bringing about this kind of result previously captured above. So we're saying individuality is a myth that us black folk, we done grab a hold to lock, stock, and barrel, but it only brings about this type of unhealthy anger that leads to self-destruction. So you create an individual, you create individuality to blind people. That's what individuality does. To blind people to collective responsibility. Consequently, once you believe in the myth of individuality, when you destroy yourself, which is the result of deliberate inculcation of self-hatred. So all he's saying there is this all by design. You're provoked, you embrace the mythology, and then you are subject to self-destruction. That's all by design. He said, then when your children grow up and see this kind of behavior, which we live in, which we perpetuate, they observe a lot of this self-destructive behavior we observe in, then they infer a correlation. In other words, they see how we acting, they see how we reacting, then as they grow up and see all that kind of stuff, about what we're saying, then they make a correlation to how black couples act, how black church folk act, how black brothers act. This how I saw y'all do it. And so they perceive it as a cause for such behavior. So since this is how they've been acting, well, shoot, this is how I'm supposed to act. I'm a black dude. I'm supposed to be, ready to jump it out, All right. Moving to a close. Then point number 6. European power and advantage conditioning. When you create certain characteristics in a people, you will force them to live under certain conditions. As a result of people adapting and learning to cope, they learn certain habits, certain perceptions, certain forms of relating to each other that becomes a part of their character. In other words, they become conditioned. I like the word socialized. They become conditioned or socialized, right? So the European white supremacy, this system, has been able to use that power to create living conditions for black folk. At the very top, it all has to do with not just feelings, but economics, sociology, and politics. So the power structure has been able to create living conditions, particularly economic and social and political living conditions. These conditions are created, listen, not only to maintain European power and advantage, but to create and maintain black characteristics, black characters, character traits, if you will. Think about the last chapter we talked about the Pavlovian rat and stuff. You put a little rat in a box, have a green light, red light, put them in a maze, and turn the light on and off certain times. It won't be very long with that rat, the dog, will be conditioned to those set of environmental circumstances you set in place. That's what he's saying here about the system with black folk. So these conditions are created not only to maintain European power and advantage, but also to maintain and create black character. In other words, we live in a slum, we live in the ghetto. And the slum, the ghetto will ultimately come to live in us. And at one point, I do a lot of rap music and whatnot, and so my circle is in space has been kind of broad, and I would always hear this say, and there were times I said, man, you can take me out the hood, but you can't take the hood out of me. Now I get that, and there are some wonderful qualities in the hood that I wouldn't dare change or criticize. But there's some other mythological characteristics that's been associated with the hood that have been put in there, on purpose, and we don't get it. So he's saying that that kind of stuff will represent itself throughout our behavior. Errant non-perception of enemies. And just to make sure we're clear, the definition of enemy is one that is antagonistic to another, a person who is actively opposed to or hostile to someone or something. And I thought it was important to mention that because the enemy is not only or always just somebody trying to kill you or something physically, but it's anybody that's antagonistic against you, towards you, or hostile towards you to keep you from coming up. So Dr. Wilson said one of our major problems is that we as black people, we have no enemies. In other words, by and large, as black people, we claim or act like we just love everybody, and ain't nobody, I don't hate nobody, there's nobody I know of that's antagonistic toward me. And maybe sometimes we feel that way. But the point is, he's saying that when you live that way, there's no way for you to change or come up or move out of your current state. He goes on to say that love is the central force we all need to survive. But there's a phoniness in this concept or idea of, I just love everybody. I ain't got no enemies. I like what Dr. John Henry Clark said in a lecture that has been famously titled No Friends, where he alludes to the absurdity of that an all-living God created man in his own image, loving his creation, and then turn around cursing him. He also mentions how religion was used to rationalize imperialism, colonialism, and slavery. And speaking of black people in relationship to this white system, this is what he said. I'm going to quote. He said, who are you, in parentheses, black folk? Who are we kidding about friends in the world? Open quote. Damn it, if you want a friend, look in the mirror. You don't have no friends. Close quote. So, and then in the destruction of black civilization, Chancellor Williams said the same thing. White America as a whole must be seen as our enemy. So our Chancellor Williams is saying this, we don't necessarily want to be superior, we don't want to be masters, we just want to be treated fairly and be loved. Fair treatment doesn't include the idea that the white man should know everything. We just want to make sure he's not discriminating in hiring, but he's still got the power. So in other words, if we're going to overcome, we got to do our part and realize that this system is in opposition to us. Maybe we're not getting lynched with ropes anymore. Maybe it's not every individual white person come across, but we can't be so disillusioned that we live in a system that's hostile and that's diametrically opposed to us. Then lastly, Amos says, he quotes Jesus, he who seeks to have his life shall lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake shall gain eternal life. It's a very interesting point. In other words, on the surface, it doesn't seem to make sense, but you have to save your life by losing it. In other words, he says, in order for the system to work the way it's going to work, a large number of people must view their deaths with a sense of hilarity and happiness. He's not saying that hard times is funny. He's just saying that those things that that destroy us, we got to see them as a kind of funny paradox. And oftentimes those things that make us feel so good are those things that kill us. You know, alcohol makes me relax. Smoking weed chronically chills me out. Taking ethanol or whatever, not ethanol, but Adderall puts me in that place. It makes me feel good. But stuff like that kills you. So he says you got to look at that. But, you know, you got to die to yourself, like the book says, in order to have life. So he says some of the individual that's seeking his pleasure will destroy him, and it has to be treated that way. But in the end, to save your life, you got to be willing to die, make sacrifices, come onto the table, make those hard decisions to give up what may be hard and painful for the better, for the sake of our family, our community, and our culture. And I stop right there.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Andre. Thank you. Thank you.